Hi, this is Ray from Honey Top Bees. This video today is just a basic introduction to honeybees, how honey is made, that I recently gave for a local church group here in South Carolina. If you're brand new to beekeeping or you just want to get some basics about bees, this could be helpful to you. I hope you enjoy it. God bless. Y'all want to stay where you're at? I feel kind of lonely up here by myself. Thank you for having me. My name is Ray Hewitt, and this is the closest speaking engagement I've ever had. Today, I'm going to talk about bees. And so just to tell you a little bit about my honeybee journey, I have been keeping bees actually since I was a child. I started keeping bees with my dad. This is actually my late father here, and that's me. If you look underneath the veil, I had a full head of hair way back then as a kid. Wasn't born as bald as I am now, and but that's me keeping bees as a kid. And that was up in New England, in the New England states. And since then, I've kind of rediscovered beekeeping over the last 10 years or so with my own children, and I've gotten interested in educating myself more about bees and beekeeping. I'm part of the University of Florida Master Beekeeping Program to be certified as a certified master beekeeper by the end of 2025. It's a 3-year program that I'm in right now, and enjoy teaching about bees because I think they're one of the most fascinating creatures that God ever made. And if we look in the Bible, bees are actually mentioned in the Bible quite a bit. If you were to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 1, that's the first time that bees are mentioned in the Bible. And if you turn to Psalm 118, there's a verse there about bees attacking somebody. That I think the imagery there is that God is going to send judgment on the nation of Israel in the same way that bees come. Have y'all ever been attacked by bees before in your life? You know that kind of feeling that they're kind of coming all over you? And that's kind of the imagery there. In Judges 14, Samson finds bees in the carcass of a lion. You might remember that story. And in Psalm 86, bees are described as storing honey in the clefts of the rock. And if you move on to the whole concept of the children of Israel moving into the promised land, and you know that story, that the land was filled with what? Milk and honey. And where does honey come from? Well, honey comes, of course, from bees. So there must have been plenty of bees in the land of Canaan for Joshua and the other spies to go in and to discover that there was so much honey there in the land. So we see bees there, but actually if we turn back a little bit, this last thing is just, I think, important. The honeybee is one of the most interesting and vital of all living creations that God has actually made. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. But if we actually look back, not even in the Bible, we just look back to archaeology, we discover that honeybees are actually found in cave paintings all the way back. There's actually a zero missing on that. That's not 1500 BC, it's actually 15,000 BC. The earliest carvings that they have of people keeping honeybees. And so this here is an image of somebody using ropes to get bees that were hanging from a cliff, which is a common image that we see. And I'm going to show you that people still do that today. Same concept here. Again, same concept here, trying to get up to get to the cliff to get to the honeybees. And then these are some cave drawings of honeycomb that you see here and here. And so honeybees and keeping of bees has been around for a really long time. And primitive cultures today still harvest honeybees in the same way as we see in those cave paintings from 15,000 years ago. And this, don't worry about the audio on this video. I just want to show you a 1-minute clip on this. I gotta figure out how to do that though. Okay, oops, no, that's not what I want. Actually, I'm not going to be able to show this video because I'm not on the Wi-Fi here. But honeybees still build their combs off of cliffs, and in primitive cultures, people go up with ropes and hang underneath the cliffs and take a stick and light it on fire so that there's some smoke and actually still harvest honey the same way as we see in those cave paintings. But I don't do any of that. I use what's called a modern hive. This is, of course, what you're probably more familiar with seeing on the sides of the road, these white boxes that are called the Langstroth hive. The Langstroth hive was actually designed by a pastor in the late 1800s. It's been the standard of beekeeping now for about 130, 140 years. And inside of this box are these frames that the bees build out this honeycomb and lay their brood, store their honey, their nectar, their pollen inside of those frames. So every one of these boxes has 10 frames in it. The number of boxes high is just determined by the strength of the colony. A good strong colony will fill up several boxes like this. A weak colony might only have just one box in the very bottom. But this is kind of what the modern beehive looks like. Bees are extremely important to our agriculture in the world. And Albert Einstein once said this. He said, if the honeybee disappears from the surface of the earth, man would have no more than 4 years to live before we ran out of food. That's how important honeybees are. Now, when Albert Einstein said this, we didn't have some of the modern agriculture that we have now, and so this is probably not likely still the case. We probably could still survive now with some of the modern inventions regarding agriculture, but the honeybee is an extremely important process of pollination. As a matter of fact, I read one time, how many of y'all are familiar with almond milk and almond products that are very popular right now? All of that comes out of California. And beekeepers from all over the nation ship their bees every February to California to pollinate. And the California almond orchards pay beekeepers to rent their beehives for a month. And if you look on the interstates, you might even see truckloads of bees being shipped in those white boxes to California. Almond producers are paying honey beekeepers like myself. I don't ship my bees there, but a lot of beekeepers will ship their bees and they only stay there for about a month, 6 weeks, and then they ship them back. But it's worth it for them because those pollinators are so vital to their production of almond. So what's happened in honeybee population? This is in millions of colonies since 1946. We had about 5.5 million colonies, all the way down to 2006, where we're down to about 3 million colonies in the United States. So over those years, since 1946 to 2006, those 50, 60 years, the amount of honeybees in America has basically been cut in half of what it actually was at one point in America. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The industrialization, the building of subdivisions, and all cleared out some of the natural places where honeybees dwell. Pesticides are a huge problem for honeybees because the same pesticides that are used in the environment, the honeybees pick them up and they bring them back into their hives and they poison their hives. Probably one of the worst, in my opinion anyway, one of the worst things that's happened even in the last 10 years is the spraying of mosquitoes, spraying for mosquitoes, and sometimes even counties where they stop now, especially in this area, but counties used to do flyovers and just spray mosquito pesticide everywhere, and beekeepers had sued the counties because they had lost all of their hives to the spraying of mosquitoes, and that's one of the worst pesticides that can be brought back into the hive and actually kills our honeybees. And then there's natural predators that are preying on the honeybees, such as the Varroa destructor mite, which is a small mite that came over here from Europe and spreads a virus among bees, and it's one of the things that we have to battle inside of our hives is mites. So there's a lot of things working against honeybees, leading to the decline of honeybees over the last 50, 60 years. The good news is since 2006, the decline has stopped. We're not going up. We're pretty much have stayed level. A lot of beekeepers have realized the problem and have taken on beekeeping, and so that's kind of increased it. But what everybody's favorite part about beekeeping is honey, right? Honey, and this is what honey looks like in its natural form. I actually brought a few blocks of honey that's still inside of the comb today. They're available on the table if you're interested in them. But if you just want to look at that and see what honey looks like inside of the comb before it's extracted, just so you know, the bees don't put it in the bottles for us, right? We have to extract it, which means we have to take the honeycomb, cut the cappings that the bees use to seal it off, put it in an extractor which spins the honey out, and we have to strain out all of the bee parts and wax particles and everything else that's in it, and bottle it up. And that's the process of extracting honey. So the question is, how do bees actually make honey? Well, it starts with the bees going from flower to flower and getting just a tiny droplet of nectar, which tastes like a sugar water. I'm sure you've all tasted and pulled like a honeysuckle out before and had that little sweet flavor to it. That's basically what the bees are after, that little bit of nectar that's in there. And they put it inside of a special stomach that they have, and they bring it to the entrance of the hive. And when they get to the entrance of the hive, they take that little bit of nectar and they pass it mouth to mouth, which is what you're seeing down there in the right-hand corner picture. They pass it mouth to mouth from one bee to another. So the foraging bee collects the nectar, brings it to the entrance, passes it off to another bee, and that bee will carry it partway inside the hive, pass it off to another bee, and this process will happen anywhere between 2 to 6 different times inside the hive, getting passed mouth to mouth to mouth, until the final bee puts it inside of a cell. Once that nectar is inside of the cell, that sugar water needs to be dehydrated, so the bees will flap their wings over it. They'll stick their proboscis, which is like a little straw-like feature they have on their mouth, down into that nectar and blow bubbles inside of it and dehydrate it so that that nectar, which starts at around 70 or 75% water, goes all the way down to 18%, and it makes a really concentrated sugar substance that we know as honey. However, in the passing of the nectar from bee to bee, they are actually regurgitating that nectar over and over again. And so you can probably say, although it's maybe not technically right, but there is some truth to it, that honey on some level is actually bee vomit, because they have regurgitated it over and over again. Now I know, I probably y'all just lost interest in honey, but let me explain maybe just a little bit more about it. So bees don't weigh very much. 1 pound of bees is 4,000 bees. In a lifetime, a bee will generate from all of its labor 1 spoonful of honey. That's all that it will generate from all of its entire lifetime. And here's how it works. A 9-ounce jar of honey requires 700 bees to travel 32,000 miles to collect 6 pounds of nectar, the sugar water that I talked about, from roughly 1.1 million flowers. That's how much effort was put into making just 1 small jar of honey. So it takes a tremendous amount of effort from the bees to be able to generate honey. Every time that a bee goes out foraging, it will visit between 50 to 100 flowers, and they'll fly within a 5-mile radius of their hive to be able to find what they need. So they don't just fly in the same yard, they'll fly a couple miles away in any direction, which is what that says there. Inside of the hive, there's 3 kinds of bees. There's the queen bee, which is in the middle. There's the drone bee, which is on the right, and there's the worker bee, which is on the left. These 3 bees are pretty fascinating. Let me just tell you a little bit about each of them. The queen bee. There's only 1 queen bee inside of every hive. It's the largest bee inside of the hive. It has the longest abdomen, longer than any other bee. This part right here on the bee. The queen bee will lay 2,000 eggs a day inside of the hive. And that is her only job inside of the hive, is to lay eggs. And so that means in a lifetime, she will lay about 800,000 to 1 million eggs inside of the hive over the course of her lifetime. And she does this all from one mating flight when she is a virgin, when she's a virgin bee. So when she's born a queen, she will go on a mating flight or a series of mating flights over the course of several days, and she'll mate with several male bees up in the air. She doesn't mate inside of the hive, she flies outside of the hive to a local spot where all the male bees are hanging out. It's kind of like the bar for bees, where all the male bees are hanging out, and she knows right where to go, and she will mate with those bees over the course of several days. Then she'll return to the hive, and then she'll never leave the hive again. That one series of mating flights will fill up a special organ that she has in her abdomen called the spermatheca, which holds the male sperm inside of her, and she will use that to fertilize eggs over the course of the next 3 years of her lifetime. She is created by starting with a regular female egg of a regular worker bee, female bee, but she's fed a special diet of a substance that is called royal jelly that the bees produce from their glands. And by feeding her that, it triggers inside of her, with the help of the Lord, it triggers inside of her a special genetics that actually make her into a very different female bee than all the rest of the female bees inside of the hive. She's not in charge of the hive, even though we call her the queen. She's not the boss. The colony actually works as one superorganism and makes decisions collectively. And she actually serves at the will of the colony. As a matter of fact, if the colony does not like her, they will kill her and make another queen. And if she's laying eggs and they don't feel like they can feed all of those eggs and all of those young larvae, they'll just come behind her and eat all of the eggs, because they are actually, she's not in charge. The colony as a whole is actually in charge. First thing she does when she comes out of her cell is, if there's any other queens inside of the hive or queen cells that haven't emerged yet, the first thing that she'll do is go and kill them, so that she is the one and only queen inside of the hive. And we already talked a little bit about the mating flights, and talked about how she stores the sperm inside for the rest of her life, and she lives about 3 years. The second kind of bee is the drone bee. This is the male bee. They are larger than the worker bee, which is the female bee, but they're smaller than the queen. They have big, large eyes, which helps them to navigate on mating flights. They do not possess any stingers. So a male bee cannot sting you. If you ever run into a drone bee, you can pick it up, you can play with it, you can pet it, whatever. I like to do it with kids. Bring them over, find the drone bee, and let the drone bee crawl around them, because they don't possess any stingers, and they also lack the ability to collect pollen or nectar. Or to put it another way, guys, sorry about this, but to put it another way, the male bees do no work inside of the hive at all. The women have to do all the work. Take that for what it's worth. You can talk that out when you get home with your spouse today. The primary role of the male bee is to mate with queens from other colonies, and after they mate, they die, and that's the end of their life. They fulfill their life purpose. And in the fall, so that the colony doesn't need to feed the male bees over the winter, the female bees will take the male bees and they will kick them out of the hive, and they will sting them to death because they have no use for them. And the females will just rule the hive over the course of the winter, and then they'll produce male bees again in the spring when they need them for mating purposes when the springtime comes around. So they don't survive the winter. And there's also not a lot of male bees in a hive. There's only a few hundred male bees inside of a hive. The main bee, though, that you see around your yard is not the queen bee, and it's not the male drone bee. The main bee that you see all the time is the worker bee, and you see a beautiful picture there of a worker bee with pollen on its legs right there. The majority of bees are worker bees. They're all female. Average colony has between 25 to 40,000 worker bees inside of it. They use their long proboscis to suck nectar from flowers, and they use their hairy legs to collect pollen. These are called pollen baskets on the back of a bee's legs, but there's really no basket there. It's actually just some hairs there, and the static They use static electricity to get the pollen to cling to their legs when they carry it back to the hive. Worker bees communicate in several different ways. They communicate through dance. And so if one worker bee, for example, finds a great source of nectar or pollen, it will go back into the hive and it will do a dance. It's called a waggle dance. And by that dance, it will communicate to all the other bees inside of the hive where to go and find nectar. This is why if you have a hummingbird feeder and all of a sudden it gets taken over by honeybees, or if you leave a piece of watermelon out in your backyard or a soda can, how do all the other bees find that? Well, one bee found it, went back to the hive, did this dance. And the dance in and of itself is pretty fascinating. And again, this just shows the work of God in creating this most fascinating creature, the honeybee. The bee does the dance and tells the other bees where to go in relationship to the sun, so that when another bee comes out of the hive, it remembers the dance, it looks at the sun, and it knows how far to go from the hive and at what angle to go from the hive in order to find that source of nectar that the bee told them about. But here's the kicker. As you know, the sun is moving all day long. Well, technically the earth is moving around the sun, but we'll just keep it simple for today, right? So the sun is moving across the sky, which means that every bee that saw that dance in the morning has to do some geometry when it comes out of the hive to figure out the change in the sun at 3 o'clock in the afternoon versus 10 o'clock in the morning to be able to find that same nectar. And they do that flawlessly because of the way that God has designed them. Isn't that fascinating? That's their waggle dance. They also communicate through pheromones or scents that they transmit. And they only live for 5 weeks. Worker bees only live for 5 weeks and then they die. They literally work themselves to death, which is why the queen constantly has to be repopulating that hive with those 2,000 eggs a day. Winter bees can live longer than the summer bees because they're not foraging, and so they live for 5 months. This is what just a couple things just to show you about a bee that might be interesting. This is the proboscis that I talked about. This is what it uses to suck up nectar. This is the honey stomach. This is where the bee stores the nectar. As you can see, it's before it gets into its intestines and its regular food stomach. So the crop is like a temporary place, about, you could just say like halfway down where they store the nectar. So when they regurgitate it, it's not going all the way down from their stomach, but it's about halfway down there. And then this is the part that you are most familiar and concerned about, and that's the stinger that is on a bee, where they will inject venom into somebody when they're trying to protect. Just a couple last slides here. Bees also, in addition to making honey, they also make wax. I brought a block of beeswax with me today. This is beeswax that's been melted down and filtered. You should take a moment and smell it if you have never smelled beeswax or it's been a while since you smelled it. It's just a beautiful, beautiful scent. Of course, in the olden days, this was what they used primarily for making candles. Nowadays, people still make candles and crafts from it, but also, as you'll see on the back table, like chapstick. Chapstick can also be made from that beeswax. And so the bees can only make wax during a certain age span of their life. So when they're young bees, like from maybe 6 or 8 days old to about 18 days old, that like 10 days, that's the only 10 days that they make wax. And they actually excrete the wax from a gland on their abdomen like you see right here. And when it comes out, it's very soft, it's very liquid, and they take that wax and it hardens into these scales when it's exposed to the air, and then they take that wax and they chew it and they form it into that perfect honeycomb shape that you're all familiar with, and make that into those beautiful cells of honeycomb. And it takes a lot of effort to make this wax. So it takes about 6 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of wax. That's a 1 pound block right there. So first of all, they've got to make all of that honey, and to make 6 pounds of honey, they'll have to bring in gallons and gallons of nectar in that little tiny crop stomach, make that honey, and then they can make the wax from that. So you can see it's a very labor-intensive process for them to be able to make honeycomb and to be able to make wax. So there's an overview of honeybees, an introduction to honeybees. I'd love to answer any questions that you have, as long as they're easy. If they're hard questions, you can ask somebody else. But I'd be glad to answer any questions, or if you have any comments or experiences with honeybees, things that you are curious about, always wanted to know. Does anybody have anything that you're interested in that you'd like to see if I know the answer to?
Do you ever had one swarm on you?
Yeah, so swarming, yeah, thanks. I have. Swarming is the natural reproductive way for a colony to duplicate itself. So it's kind of, I know for you, when you see a swarm, you're like, swarm of bees, panic or whatever. But for a beekeeper, we're like, yes, that's awesome, we love that. Because when a colony gets so strong in the spring, it reproduces itself, and so it will swarm. What it does is, first of all, it makes a brand new queen, and right before that queen hatches from her cell, half of the colony will leave with the old queen, the original queen. They will leave and they will go to a new location, and then when that virgin queen hatches, she will stay with the original hive. And so you get 2 hives out of it. So when people call me and say, I have a swarm, I'm like, yes, free bees. I love free bees, right? And so swarming is that reproduction. And the way bees swarm is this. Half of the colony leaves with the old queen, and they first will go into a tree and hang from a tree. Maybe you've seen that before. Maybe you've been concerned about that. They don't stay in the tree because they typically don't live in exposed areas. They want to go into a cavity of some sort. But they'll leave, and while they're in the tree, the scout bees will go out and find a place, a permanent home, a permanent cavity where they can stay. And then once the scout bees find that, then the swarm will move into that cavity. And I get calls, pretty regularly of somebody that has bees in their soffit in their house, bees in the walls of their house where there's a little hole in the exterior of their siding, and the bees got in there and they made a nest inside of their house. They love to find little, dark places like that to find their new nest. So bees swarm regularly, and that's just a part of beekeeping. There are some things that I do, for example, to prevent them from swarming. Is I'll go ahead and split my hive into 2 hives in the spring, which makes them think that they already swarm because half of the bees left. So I'll divide them into 2, and then that will kind of help reduce the amount of swarming. So, great question.
How many times have you been stung?
This week, probably 20 this week. I can't tell you how many times I've been stung over my lifetime. You do build up a sting immunity, so it doesn't really bother me at all to be stung anymore. Initially, it's like, got me again, and it lasts for maybe 30 seconds to a minute. The pain is very short-lived now. It used to be that I'd swell up and it would, hurt and have to go through the whole ice thing, and my mom used to put tea on my, tea bags and all that. But now it doesn't really even bother me, and honestly, like yesterday I probably was stung about 5 or 6 times, because bees are especially mean in August, because there's nothing for them to forage on right now. Everything's dried up, and so they've got nothing to do, and they're trying to protect what they have. And so I think I got stung a half a dozen times yesterday, and by the nighttime I couldn't even remember where the stings were and couldn't find them. So, yes?
I live about 3 miles from here.
Okay.
I grow flowers.
Okay.
You know how many, this is sad to say, you know how many bees I've seen this year?
No? You only seen one bee?
Dead.
What's that?
And he was dead.
Oh, and he was dead. Yeah. Yeah.
I've seen more than that, but that's
Yeah.
about what I can remember.
One bee.
Bumblebees, none, hardly.
Yeah.
You can count on my hand, I know.
Mhm.
So what's happening to
It wasn't like it. It wasn't like that before, was it? But it is a problem. I hear that a lot, and sometimes people ask me to, put hives on their property, and if they're close by, I might consider it. But it's hard for me to go to all the different places or whatever. But that's part of that whole honeybee decline thing that you mentioned.
people are using a lot of insecticide too.
They are, yeah. All of those things are affecting the honeybee population for sure. So
They want to see their pretty grass, everything they spray.
the bees bring all those chemicals back into the hive, and ultimately they land up in your honey as well. So just always, that's something else to consider as well. One thing I didn't mention about honey that I want to mention to you, when you're buying honey, you should, well, first of all, I always say you should support your local beekeepers because it costs a lot of money to keep bees. But even if you go to the grocery store like Food Lion and buy honey, there's 2 different kinds of honey that are available inside of your grocery store. And if you go there, you'll find that even Food Lion has a local produce rack. It's kind of in the back there's some honey right now in the front, but there's also a rack in the back where you're buying from a local beekeeper. And South Carolina law requires that the local beekeepers in South Carolina, that they put their address on the on the label, so you can know you're buying local honey. If you go in the main baking section and buy honey, you're going to find that honey is made in Brazil or made in India, and it's going to say 100% pure honey on it, but it's a little deceptive. Because there's no national regulation on imported honey, they can say it's 100% honey because the honey that is in there is 100% honey. It's just there's other things inside of it. So you got to be really cautious about the honey that you find in the baking section. But the honey in the baking section is going to be cheaper than buying local honey for sure. But just be aware, it may not matter to you, but if it does matter to you, the honey on the shelves is oftentimes, I can't say 100%, but it's oftentimes not all honey. There's fillers that they put inside of it to make it go a lot farther.
I've heard that if you take like a teaspoon of honey, local honey, that it helps your allergies. Is there any truth to that?
There is some anecdotal research that supports that. I've seen some people try to validate it scientifically, and the results have come back mixed. But the idea actually, in concept, makes sense. If you buy honey from Brazil, the bees would have gotten that nectar and pollen. Because that honey, all honey has not just the nectar, the sugar water inside of it, it also has elements of pollen inside of it. And so they're going to get that pollen from local flora in Brazil. And so if you take that, we don't have that flora, so you're not going to build up any resistance to the allergens that are in that pollen, because you're building up resistance to allergens from South America, right? So if you buy local honey, you're building up resistance to the allergens that are in the pollen from local flora sources. So that's the idea behind that.
Well, too, I've heard of people taking the honeybees and letting them sting themselves.
Sting therapy is becoming a more popular thing, especially for diseases like arthritis. That a lot of people see a lot of help with joint pain and all from sting therapy. It's a whole thing. I don't know a lot about it. I've read on it. It's part of my master beekeeping program, but so I can't really speak a lot to it other than to know it's a thing. And if any of y'all want to practice sting therapy, come on down the road. I got a couple of hives right now that need no prompting. They don't need any payment. They will do it for free.
You should feel good. You should not have any.
I know, my joints are great. Somebody else had a question? Yes, sir.
How come honey will turn to sugar?
What? Like when it gets crystallized?
Yeah.
Right, great question. First of all, I want to say when your honey gets crystallized, there's nothing wrong with your honey. Okay, it's not gone bad, it's not defective. Honey is a very unique substance in that it is a highly concentrated sugar that still stays inside of a liquid form. It's not even, some people have said it doesn't even make sense scientifically. It's again, the hand of God to provide something for us like that. Over time, especially when exposed to light, honey exposed to light and to certain temperatures, the honey can crystallize, which will form into like a mushy crystals, I guess. And all you need to do is a couple of things. You can do it in a microwave, or you can just take that jar of honey and put it inside some warm water. Boiling water probably is too much, more like 150 degrees water, and you're basically just going to melt it back down to its liquid form, where it will stay in its liquid form for a long time. If you prevent your honey from crystallizing, I suggest keeping it in your pantry in a dark place, because the combination of light or extreme temperatures can make your honey crystallize faster. But crystallized honey is another indication that you bought pure local honey, because the honey you get from Brazil and from India and all of that is pasteurized to prevent it from crystallizing, because you don't want to go into the Food Lion and have your honey, buy it off the shelf that's crystallized. And because it takes so long to get from foreign countries to America, they pasteurize it, and so the pasteurization breaks down the enzymes inside of the honey and changes its flavor, etc. And so again, that's another reason to support local honey.
And you have to feed these bees in the wintertime.
And the summertime. I'm actually feeding right now. So yes, I actually, unfortunately, one of the bad parts about keeping bees in South Carolina is our nectar flow is super short. It only lasts about 10 weeks. It's April, May, and 2 weeks of June. That's our nectar flow. We take our honey off the second week of June, off of the hives, and then pretty much the rest of the year they're either going to eat whatever honey we have left on the hives, or we have to feed them. So right now I'm feeding sugar water, I'm feeding pollen substitute, because there's nothing in the environment right now to speak of that they can eat, and I will have to feed them all winter. Most of my hives have already eaten through all the reserves that I left on the hive in June. They're already gone, and so I will be feeding them right now through until April.
How do you do that? Like a hummingbird feeder or something?
Something similar. I feed them inside of the hive with a special frame that sits inside of the hive where they can get sugar water. I feed them in the yard with a special slow feeder that the bees just go to every day. But it's a similar concept to a hummingbird feeder, yeah.
How do you remove bees from internal walls, external walls?
Yeah, so what I do is I have to cut the wall.
You cut the wall.
Oh yes, absolutely, yeah. I cut a piece of either from the outside, I'll have to remove the siding, cut the plywood, or if I'm doing it from the inside, I'll cut the sheetrock. Usually I have to cut, well, I did one right down the road here that I had to cut about a 3 foot wide, maybe it's 2 foot wide, because it's 24 inches, the studs are 24 inches on the center. And so 2 foot wide, and it's about 6 feet tall. And I had to cut out a big block of sheetrock. And inside the bees had just made long, 3 foot long combs that were that long. And I have a special vacuum that I can vacuum the bees up, that it won't hurt them. I cut the combs out, I take the combs and put them into those wooden frames, and then I take the bees and reunite them with the comb inside of a colony inside of the at my apiary down the road.
How do you know you have bees in your internal walls?
Well, you would see them coming and going. So you would see activity somewhere on the outside where they're getting in and out. They don't just go in and stay. They're going to have to go in and out constantly to be bringing in food and resources. So you would notice them. Sometimes I had one last week up in Newberry, or not last month rather, up in Newberry, to where they saw honey coming through their wall. That the honey had begun to drip in their wall, and so that's how they knew. They didn't hear him, they didn't see him, but most people will see him coming and going. So.
Oh, it looks like from pictures I've seen, you can smoke bees. What does the smoking do?
What the smoking does is it won't make the bees leave, for example, inside of your hive. All it does is that, I told you that bees communicate through scent, pheromones that they emit. What the smoke does is it masks the pheromones so that they're not able to communicate with each other. If they were able to communicate with each other, they could all emit an alarm pheromone that says we're being attacked, and so it makes them aggressive. So when we smoke the bees, what we're doing is we're not giving them the ability to communicate that somebody is coming into their space, into their hive. And because they can't communicate with each other, they all just kind of go down into the hive and huddle up and say, hey, what's going on here? We can't talk anymore. And so the smoke will last maybe 5 to 10 minutes, and then once it gets cleared out, they're able to communicate with pheromones. And that when they can communicate, then they can emit alarm pheromones that says, hey, Ray is inside of the hive right now, let's sting him. And they all get together, and that's not a good scene when they're able to do that. Yeah, so you're disarming them basically by smoking them, but you're not, it doesn't remove them, it just calms them down because they're not gonna attack you in that mode. Yeah. Y'all, good questions. And I don't usually get this many questions. So yay, I'm so proud of you. You did great. I enjoyed being with you today. Thank you for inviting me.